Muito bem-vindos ao Fórum 16.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Fórum 16. We have some announcements, especially for those that are in this face-to-face meeting. We are going to talk about the facilities. Our sponsors, they have some booths. They have the exhibition booths on the right-hand side, so you can access the booths through the back door. And behind this room, there is another area that you can access the booths. In the outside area, we have espresso coffee available. And I believe that's it. The certificate of this event is only going to be delivered for those that are here today. This event is being broadcast by Facebook and YouTube in Spanish and in English. And this material is going to be recorded and it will be made available in the NICBR video session and YouTube. On the website of the Infrastructure Week, you will find a topic with some tips. And there is a map of this region and some restaurants and barbecue places and shopping malls in the region. So we have several options available.
Atrás ali também na área de circulação, logo próximo da área de
registro,
tem uma área de chapelaria.
In the walking area, there is a storage desk where you can access the service and keep your belongings in this storage area. In the agenda of this event, we have a social activity on Thursday. It's a party we are organizing, and we are not able to welcome all of you for this party. So in this afternoon session, we will send you the link for those that are here today to enroll for the party and to confirm their presence if they are willing to attend the party, because we have a shortage of places available. So I believe it's important to thank our sponsors that allow us to organize an event of this size, so that the 12th second of Internet infrastructure in Brazil, it is an initiative of NICBR and CGI-BR. And this is allowed by the registers of domain NIC.br. We also have Compactway, Netflix, Tenec Technology, Global OP Networks, Elea Digital, Cisco Partners, Siena, Electronet, T-Brasil, EBS Global, Corelate, Flex Optic, Global, WZ Tech Networks, Cent, Meta, and the support of Italian networks. Now we are going to watch some videos from our sponsors.
internet pulsa, tem vida própria.
Internet
São
has
5,3
a
bilhões de
pulse
pessoas
in its
conectadas
own
em todo
life.
mundo.
We have billions of people
É inimaginável
connected
viver
worldwide, so it's unimaginable to
Há 26
live
anos, ela
offline.
surgiu e mudou radicalmente a forma
And
como a sociedade se
26
organiza.
ago it was sent,
Por trás dessa
organized
revolução
and
digital,
changed
há
our
inúmeros
lives.
atores
So
que foram
behind
e são
this
essenciais
digital
para manter a
inclusion, there are
internet
key
operando de forma
players
livre,
to
transparente
maintain
e justa.
the web operating
ecossistema
in a
pujante de
seamless
empresas
and
e de
fair way.
infraestrutura.
And this requires companies and
Tecnologias e
infrastructures
aplicações
and
que garantem a
technologies and
contínua expansão da
applications
internet
that will
e
ensure the
impulsionam a
continuous
transformação
expansion
digital.
of the
Sem elas,
internet and
e os
digital
usuários, a
information.
internet não
Without
existe.
that and with no users, we could not have it. The Brazilian Association of Internet, ABRANET, supports the system and the network supply chain in this industry. And with its strength and representativeness, we have this group of companies that supports us. That's why there are plenty and different. We have telecom companies, data centers, application companies that united are stronger at ABRANET, which is the first association of internet in Brazil, and in supporting its members, it has a key role in the three powers: executive, legislative, and judiciary. And these are all relevant aspects supporting the public policies and having a decision-making approach towards that. So we provide business models so the companies can be more competitive. We have an open channel for information sharing, as well as an environment that encourages the use of network and encourages businesses as well. So that's ABRANET, and please join us.
Everybody's going to the party, have a real good time. Dancing in the desert, blowing up the sunshine.
Já imaginou se você não tivesse seu direito à
Can you
liberdade de
imagine
expressão
if you
respeitada?
did not have your right and liberty and freedom of expression respected? Your data would be disclosed without your authorization, and also you would have the internet affected due to businesses' interests. So neutrality and the safety and security of the Internet are key aspects of the Internet in Brazil. CGIBR provides you constant innovation, Internet security, and services available, all in a collaborative way, seamless and democratic. And it is formed by all sectors of society, and decision-making is made through dialogue and participation of all members until consensus is achieved. So this Brazilian model of governance became a benchmarking worldwide, and CGIBR providing a best internet in the country. Better internet in the country. When you register a .br domain, you are contributing for the improvement of the internet in Brazil. So this is registered by NICBR, which is the information center of the internet control. So it provides services to prevent incidents of security, provides support in the technologies of implementation, controls the local traffic of internet, and contributes for the global development of internet and even more. NICBR is a private, civil, non-profitable center that provides reliable services and referred parts of what you pay for your domain as developing tools for the infrastructure. All this innovation and state-of-the-art technology and safety is only possible because you have a .br domain. NICBR always looking for the best in our internet.
Bom, agora, dando continuidade,
So now, continuing, I would like to invite Milton Kaoru Kashiwakura for the opening ceremony. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. After almost 3 years apart, we are here again. We organized 2 events online, and I will speak about some key information that happened along this period, and it's good to use the statistical data for that. So I'm taking this household survey to show you what happened during this time period of October 2021 and March 2022, and we have interesting data available. Very briefly, we have here 2020, which was the period where we had the survey organized in a different format. So these data, as you can see, for this reason, since we used a different methodology, we can consider this type of data a bit distorted. But we can see that there was a leap from 2019 to 2021 of 71 to 82% in the households, so 9 points in this leap. And what's interesting is that in the rural area, we had a leap of 20 points, or an increase in 20 points. So it showed the Brazilian internet grew a lot in this time period. So we have the households that have internet available in 82%, in urban area 73%, in rural area 82%. 83%, better saying. The technologies used, fiber or cable, and followed by other
Aqui,
technologies.
né, pessoal, é interessante notar,
What is
né,
interesting
que
to take into
tem uns
account
dados
here
aqui que é
is
curioso, né? Quer dizer que se você pega a
some
região
data
Nordeste,
which are quite interesting in
77%,
Northeast region,
você pega a região
77%,
Norte, 79%
and
das
Northeast
residências
region
atendidas.
have
Só que a
79%,
tecnologia, né,
North
quer dizer,
region
que a gente enxerga aqui, né,
79% of the households
ela,
with
vamos dizer
internet
assim,
available.
ela tem lá a
But
parte
technology
de fibra.
has cable and optics facilities available in other regions, but we can see that the North region has the mobile network available, services available in 3G and 4G. So these are very interesting data, and it's worth taking in this survey into account.
Na parte de celular, né, quer dizer, que a
When we talk
conexão
about
por
cell
celular,
phones and cell phone
então você vê aqui
connection,
que vários usuários, né,
we can see that
acabam
several
utilizando as duas
users
tecnologias, né, tanto o
are
Wi-Fi ou pela
using
rede móvel, né,
two
mas a gente vê
technologies,
aqui,
both
né, quer dizer, que na
Wi-Fi
região
and
norte
mobile
aqui,
network
e você tem
services.
alguns acessos aqui
And
só
we
por
can see that we have
Wi-Fi
some
ou só por
only
redes
Wi-Fi
móveis, né?
access
E
or only
você vê que,
mobile
vamos dizer
network
assim, as outras
access.
regiões aqui,
And
principalmente
in other regions, especially Southeast and Southern region and Central West region, we have predominantly people using both technologies.
bem.
Well,
E também tem essa TIC
and
provedores. Eu
we
estou
also
colocando aqui a
have the
TIC
TIC
provedores,
providers.
porque
I
essa
wrote
pesquisa aqui
TIC
acontece a cada
providers
3
because
anos.
the
É
survey
importante
occurs
que
every
vocês
3 years,
colaborem aí
and it's
com
important to have
com
your
essas informações.
contribution with your
E interessante aí que a
information
gente
and
consegue aí,
data.
né, a última
So it's
estatística, apesar de
interesting
ser
that the
de
latest
2020, a gente vai
statistics,
fazer agora
although it happened in
2023, né,
2020 and we are
tem uma
going to
estimativa
have a
aqui de
next
quantidade de
survey
empresas provedoras
in
no país. Então, essa pesquisa aqui mostra
2023, we
como é que
can
está o
see
crescimento
that
dessas
the survey
empresas.
shows
Tá?
how these
como
companies
está a
are
declaração de
growing,
acesso
and
lá
what
no tempo.
about the access statement from
Aí,
Anatel?
essas empresas aí a gente também
These
consegue
companies,
perceber
we
que
can
tem várias empresas aí, né, que
we
têm
can see that
poucos clientes ou que têm bastante
some of them
clientes.
have a few clients or a large number of users, so you can see if it is a very small and large sized company. So very small or micro companies have more than less than 49 employees, and we have a major concentration of these micro and small sized companies all over Brazil, and we can see a larger amount of providers, especially in the south and southern region, southeast and southern region, as you can see in the slide. The survey also shows the access technology used by such providers. We can also have the IX participation, which is within the range of 35%, and it is sent to several regions in Brazil. We also have IPv6 survey, 44%, that's the average in Brazil, and these are the type of data that provide us the guidance and the decision-making process, and take into account all the expenses of this market, those that were under attack. And we had 1,793 providers that claimed they had hacking attacks, and 35% continued operating, 51% continued operating, but slowly. About IX, within this time period, I got some data that we had on a T-shirt. In 2010, we had 14 sites, 200 AS attendees, 40 GBps, and 6,000 terabytes per month. So today we are now available in 35 sites. We have 3,468 members, and we could reach more than 26 terabytes per month. We had also an increase in the autonomous systems, and we can see that in 2020 we began to have autonomous systems that only had IPv6 available. And these are really interesting data. Some of them have IPv4 and IPv6, and some only IPv6. Some facts, I believe it's good to remember. In March 2020, we had the first death caused by COVID-19 in Brazil. In March 18th, we had added traffic that in the XBR surpassed 10 terabytes per second. Then in March 23, we had added traffic that surpassed 11 terabytes. We had a reduction in the quality of streaming in March 25th. In July, in São Paulo, we had the highest level of outreach. In August 19, we had the IPv4 that was really exceeding in the region of LAC. In August, we reached 10 terabytes, and we had now 4,045 million domains available, and we have a high level of representativeness in Latin America. Here you see the representation in Latin America compared against other countries such as Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, and the rest of the region.
Over this period, we've become number one in terms of resilience. So there is a company, Radar.Curator, that carries out a survey, and our ranking moved up, first of the year. So that means whenever there's a problem on the network, we're the country with the highest resilience. Also, in this period, we've had an abrupt price fall in São Paulo, for example, from 2.5 in 2019. It dropped to $2 and $1 in 2020, and 70 cents in Mbps in 3 gig ports. So this is interesting to see what has happened in our region. And this is the data that was collected in the beginning of the pandemic. So it's interesting to see the growth and the fluctuations that followed as regards quality metrics. When there's trouble, the amount of measurements increases drastically, and we could carry out a survey that shows that the South and Southeast are best in terms of quality. So we're measuring packages. The North is the worst, followed by the Northeast and Midwest, that show a quality that is inferior to that of the South and Southeast, but it's not as bad as in the North.
são dados aí
So
que
this
vem
is
coletando no
data that we've collected over the period.
O OpenCDN, a gente
OpenCDN,
fez bastante ações aí.
well, we had a number of initiatives in terms of OpenCDN, and we have a project, and we'll have a presentation today by the people from Manaus to talk about the project. So here we've got a table where you see key CDNs, not all of them, but the most important ones and how they are distributed in each of the IXs. And we will now start working with this project in Recife. This is the Manaus effect. So we launched OpenCDN in late 2020, and we see the effect on the traffic because of this project. In Salvador, Bahia, that started a lot earlier, we learned a number of lessons, and Julio is going to talk more about Salvador, what has happened, and it's very interesting as well because of this project. Okay, for this event, we will have the launch of the Autonomous Systems portal directed at internet providers. So we'll have this presentation. We'll have debates about the importance of IX for the internet providers in the country, neutral networks, the influence of 5G for ITC infrastructure providers, and what we are doing in terms of TV white space. So you'll hear about the details of how this has been carried out, routed optic network, challenges for implementation of IPv6, and other topics. And also a presentation about 10 years of Netflix. So Thomas Volner, Public Policy Director, will be here to talk about the 10 years of Netflix in Brazil. A curiosity with the arrival of Netflix, and we joke, the IX team thanks them, because before Netflix we would work to alter the network over the weekend. Now with the arrival of Netflix and other streaming companies, what has happened is that this profile changed, and the weekends became a period of high traffic. So the team said it wouldn't make sense to work over the weekend. So we started introducing the changes also during the week. So the team is thankful as well. And hereby I open our event. I wish you all a very fruitful event for all of you. I hope it will be interesting to all of you. Ask your questions, please interact, because there's lots of content and it's very interesting. Thank you, Milton, for opening our event. I'd like to invite Julio Sirota. He's going to talk about infrastructure and engineering on IX. Okay, let's move ahead. I will share with you data that I usually share every year and a few quick comments. And today we have two main topics that I'd like to approach, and I think it will be interesting. As regards growth, that we've seen this year. It was 30% in total traffic volume. São Paulo is close to 19 terabytes per second. And a few highlights here about these numbers on the smaller table refer to Salvador, as Milton mentioned. They've grown 78% in traffic, which is really significant. We have Fortaleza and Rio to the tune of 40%. New ASNs that were registered in Brazil, we usually track that year upon year. And we always expect that new ones are created, and some of them are connected to IXBR. We can see that in 2022 there was a reduction vis-a-vis previous years. But let's remember, since we brought forward the date of the event, the sampling period is shorter, so I'm comparing this data with the previous event. So we're short 1 month. As regards the number of participants, I'd like to highlight Brazil and Salvador, an increase of 24%, particularly Salvador because of the Open CDN project. It had a very important impact on traffic, and Brasilia is a place we're investing heavily. We're starting Open CDN activities, and we expect to see growth. As regards installed capacity, this is the number of the capacity that we make available for connection of users. We've had a slightly slower growth in São Paulo to the tune of 19%. Rio, we moved ahead a bit more with 67%. And we also see in terms of optical transport, last year we submitted a plan of 69 terabits that we would like to implement in São Paulo, but we only managed to implement 58. And the forecast for late 2023 of 74. And the explanation is simple. We didn't receive the appropriate equipment, so we've been working throughout 2022 with no new switch that we call pizza box. So these are boxed equipment, which is what we use for access in the various spots. We got some equipment for São Paulo. I'll go into it later on. And this was equipment that we bought in July 2021. As regards this chart, we see the kinds of connections that we've got in São Paulo. We've tracked that year upon year. So we see here a growth of the type 6 connections, which are shared connections, slightly smaller growth, but growing. 1 gig ports have dropped over the past 2 years, 25% in 21, another 20% this year. And the numbers in parentheses refer to last year. 10 gig ports are falling. They fell 2% last year, and this year 10%. And 100 gig ports are still growing, 27% this year. Very well. I've been showing you the slide over the past 4 years, but we never give up. Our purpose is to implement EVPN in the traffic exchange points, particularly in São Paulo. We believe that owing to the size of the network, it's important to have this kind of technology. We've had advances this year, and we envisage that next year we'll have trials or a pilot initiative using this technology. Now, to implement that in São Paulo, we'll need to plan and start initiatives that will take at least 2 to 3 years before we can update and prepare all the equipment to do the migration. But this is still on the agenda. Very well. The first major topic is exactly this migration that we did in the São Paulo network core. This is the slide that I showed you last year with the situation that we had. Core equipment showed a use rate of 90% of the ports, and we planned to migrate to 400 gig. So this was the network, the previous network that we had. This is late last year. We had 2 boxes in the central PICs, and the data centers that were connected to these key points. We had box sets with multiples of 100 gig, and the objective at the end of this migration would be for us to be able to replace most of the PICs to work with 400 ZR, which is a 400 gig transceiver that can be placed plugged straight to the network equipment and connect to multiplexing to do the transport. Last year, we expected to acquire a line card with 400 gig ports, but we ended up revising the number of ports that we had planned to buy, and we ended up not buying it. So this is last year's slide showing that we might have a few PICs working with DCI and 400 ER and some 10 gig channels at the same time. As I said, we purchased this equipment in mid-2021, and we received 2 chassis late last year, but only the chassis. And you can't do anything with a chassis. You need the line cards. And the line cards got here in May 2022, and then we thought, well, we can start doing something. So the first intervention was to include a new network equipment between the 2 center pieces. This equipment was installed at NIC and U in the Nações Unidas building, and then we migrated the connectivity of PICs that have a direct connection, where we use LR4 transceivers. We do not use DCI. So it's a small number of PICs, but enable us to observe how the boxes were behaving, if everything was working properly, because one thing is to do a lab trial, and a different thing is when you have the equipment in production. So for 2 weeks, we just observed the equipment. We had no trouble. And then in the second overhaul window, we migrated all the other connections that we had on the previous equipment to the new equipment. This was done during an overhaul window, But we had no expectation that there would be any interruption to the operations, because today we work with VPLS to direct traffic. If there's a failure on one route, it automatically transfers to another. And we've had no trouble whatsoever. It was really smooth, a smooth migration from the unavailability point of view. So we observed this box for a whole month before we replaced the second box, which would be Nick JD. So we connected the box to the data center, and then there was an issue. Although we own the data center and we have absolute control over the situation, there were power limitations. Power, which is a trouble that we face at most places where we have equipment, because we expand and there's no power, and we come to a point where there's no more power for you to use the equipment. So we have to run after solutions. Owing to this power limitation, we couldn't connect both boxes with all line cards. So we would need to have a tiered implementation, removing certain connections from one box and putting it in the second, and regrouping connections in other points and activating line cards in another piece of equipment. And then what we ended up doing, the network crew felt sure that it would work, so we said, okay, let's test our redundancy. And so we turned off the equipment. We've seen a number of presentations about web scales of large content companies that have initiatives to test out the redundancy, what would happen if there were really a major failure. So we took this opportunity under very controlled and safe conditions. We turned the equipment off, and soon after that, we migrated all the connections from one piece of equipment to another, so the same rack. It was easy from the physical point of view to do this migration. I believe it took us 8 hours to do it.
The next step, we replaced the connections between the two transceivers RL4 to 400R ER. So it was the first connection with 400 ER that we made available for production, and we began the migration to 1 PIX, where we had a new box that could support doors of 400 gigs, and we began to operate this PIX combining DCI, which are pieces of equipment that have transponders, and they have coherent operation system, which is almost equivalent to the 400 ER, which is similar to the 400 ER inside a PDD, which is a transceiver. So that's a picture of the command control equipment. So these light blue cables are the MPO cables that connect the network pieces of equipment to the DCIs, and in dark blue you have single-mode fibers and connectors of LCPC and transceivers of L4 type. Here you see the picture of the new pieces of equipment. The artists of the cabling services just developed this work of art. So the NIC JD continues with its clear cables, and in the NIC MU we requested a series of locking tables that have optic fibers of 72 connectors each. So they were split in 7 racks in distance, and we prepared all the cabling system to implement this complex change in terms of infrastructure. That's it. I believe this migration of the central peaks was a landmark for us in Sao Paulo, and that's a huge network, and we could implement that with excellent teamwork, infrastructure, planning in place that allowed us to perform that in a short time and with no hindrances in the operation of the network. So without the central redundancy with the former devices, we would take 4 to 6 months to implement all maintenance and activities we had to. That's a slide from the former year about the operational freezing. It's the same type of operation. We will not have freezing during the World Cup. We are just going to freeze all our activities. We'll keep on our daily activities, and we will only stop all actions during the Black Friday. On the 24th and 25th of November, the Thursday and Friday or Black Friday, because in case we have any events happening in the network, we will be exempted for any responsibility. The second topic that I would like to share with you today is about the service level of the IXBR. This is a topic that took us some time to implement in a more formal way, and this is what we are willing to start doing from now on. The first step of this activity was to express the type of standard service level we are going to use. The XBR project is a collaboration process, and it has the domain of 100% of the entire structure. We have some partnership with some companies that in collaboration with us, they supply the infrastructure, deleted fibers or hired fibers from third parties, and what we can be accountable for is what is under the control of INC and IXBR. It's different from an operator that has the total control over their network. If we would hire all resources that we use from contractors, we would have a totally different cost. Probably would not have the size we have today. So this statement of standard service level is what we do today. Infrastructure availability is through network and routing servers, and the collaborations and the operation of these pieces of equipment. If we have fiber issues in a data center, we will not consider this as a failure of the infrastructure we supply, but from the contractor that is working with us. So about this topic, we will not have any control over. The other items, technical support, maintenance, and activation, we have this data stated in the agreement, the user agreement of the IXBR. So everyone that is online and uses it, especially in São Paulo, Rio, and Fortaleza, they will have access to this type of information. But inside the scope of the IXBR, we know there are demands of a better quality service. So they would like to have an additional and differentiated service provided. What we are willing to do is to implement an additional service, but the basic assumption is that this could not impact the current services we are providing. So we do not want to worsen the services we are provided to have an additional service provided. On the other hand, on the contrary, I will explain it to you later what we want to do. So this offer will meet the demands that we have in operation and an agreement terms to one of our users that requests this formal statement. And it varies. Even at the international level, we have this type of demand. In order to implement this additional service, probably we would require new resources. We will need to improve our processes. We are working on that, but certainly this will expedite in the future. So we believe that with this implementation, we will be able to enhance the standard service we already provide. And the final objective is to have improvement in the customer satisfaction. This type of additional service will have a cost per participant. It's different from what we charge today. We charge the operational costs we have today. We will have some penalization when we do not comply with the level of services which are specified, and this will enable you to have a discount of this credit in the next invoice, in the coming invoice, so that those that want to have this type of service hired, they will have a outsourced service format. So they will have another company that will have dedicated personnel to provide this type of service, and we expect this will be a good quality service, and we will activate all these efforts in this additional service provided in SLA, so to ensure what we are stating, and we will have some activations and migrations that will happen out of the business hours. So Very briefly, we will make available in the document session of IXBR the definition of the standard service provided and the additional service level provided. And we are just in the final phase of reviewing the documentation and analyzing the final details, and we expect it to be ready from November 15th on. So the agreement will be celebrated from 1st of December on, so then the legal department will conclude everything after everything is analyzed. The availability of the infrastructure is the same. We will not have a differentiated network available for those that will hire an additional service level. If we require a higher availability than we forecast, we will have a credit of 6% in the value of the monthly fee paid. These are issues that are under the accountability of IXBR. The penalties for the support, the technical support category, for instance, we have no traffic, the service is unavailable. Sometimes we have service available but with operational issues. And the other aspect is you have a traffic exchange, but there is an issue in any type of service. Then we will have initial time to solve the problem. For the first case, up to 4 hours. For the second case, up to 12 hours. In the service case, up to 36 hours. In case of any delay in any calls, we will generate a credit and a monthly value of 3%. For the maintenance services, which was a switch from MIC to the right router on the side of the user, and prefixes and operational as things that happen in the operational side, it would be a deadline up to 4 hours, and penalties if we do not comply with that. And what changes is the time for the interaction during the calls, and normally is 5 days, and we will switch that to 4 hours. The physical installation, transceivers, connectivity, devices, and provisioning would change for 2 calendar days and 10 calendar days for the other areas. And sometimes these are more complex installations. And during the activation process, which is the final part of the process, together with the user, we should have an interaction up to 15 minutes at the most, so the process would be concluded rapidly. And any delay would allow the user to have a 3% credit in the resource that is being used or activated. And the question is to provide additional connectivity to enhance the capacity, the accrued capacity, and these time changes also are going to be the same. Deactivation, there are no penalties because we will take into account the data when the call entered, and from that date on we will consider that deactivated, and the PIX migration is considered deactivation. Maximum monthly penalty that will have these values and fees is limited to 50% of the monthly paid value. And the cost we will have an additional cost based on the resources that are used. So we will have a list, 50% for a 10 gig door, 40% for 100 gig door, and we do not have it in the price table, but we do have it to be available until the end of the year. And this 1 giga door will not have any additional service level provided, and this has a tend to end in the future. And for those that are connected via 6, and the idea is to pay 100% more of the value, which we think is a very small amount. In addition to that, the 6 operator will have to choose for the hiring of an additional service level, and we will express how this operation is going to happen in the future. And the agreement of additional service level will have a minimum time of 12 months, and with a fee if it's canceled up to 50% of the value until the end of the agreement. And the penalties are going to be calculated based on the pricing table that is in force. So that was the topic that I wanted to share with you. That's something new, and the idea is to discuss about it. And we will not have time available today, but on Thursday you have the talk with the IAX section, and we will have room for discussing about these topics with all of you. If you have any questions, if you want any additional information, you can contact us through email and conventional channels, and we will try to share additional data with you. Just to conclude my presentation, I would like to mention, as I always mention every year, the list of support calls that we had during the time period of October 2021 until September 22, and the root cause of the issues. This year, unfortunately, we're not able to activate any new site. We have at least 1 or 2 in the final steps of this process, but the difficulty in equipment stock delay the process. So for 2023, we included, in addition to the 3 capitals that were missing, we included Caruaru and Feira de Santana, which are the new sites where we will implement this traffic exchange point. So that is what I wanted to share with you. And the remote attendees, if they want to ask questions, request our feedback, you can enter your questions in the chat, and we will then try to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. We're a little bit behind, so we'll have the questions at the end. Very well. Now, I'd like to invite Eduardo Barazal Morales. He's going to talk about IPv6. Eduardo. I am Eduardo Barzal Morales. I'm here to talk about IPv6 and the course agenda to show you what we've been planning for 2023. So to talk about IPv6, we have to talk about IPv4. So in terms of the waiting time on the queue, today we have in LACNIC an average time of 671 days. And if you join the queue today, you'll have to wait for at least 5 years to get the IPv4. So we are towards the end of IPv4 globally, and we are suffering from this shortage. So we need to wait. So there's no reason for us not to think about IPv6. And if we think about the waiting list, we have 888 autonomous systems waiting to receive the IPv4 in the LACNIC. And looking at the graph, the chart, we have the red and the blue. Blue is new requests, and red is what's being answered. So we see that there's an increase in new requests, and we cannot answer at the same rate. So the number is rising. So from the charts, you see that this is growing consistently. So thinking about IPv4, we cannot delay that too much. Can we wait for 5 years, 7, 10 years? We have to think about IPv6. And here I'm going to tell you about the adoption of IPv6 globally and in Brazil. Now, showing this Google connectivity chart, we see that we're close to 40%. And this chart shows from 2011, when we have 0%, and Nick BR already had the project for IPv4 to try and stimulate adoption of the protocol in Brazil, and adoption was really low. And then we had the exhaustion phases globally, and close to 2015, this growth showed or gave us the idea that it would be an exponential growth. But you can see that since 2016, we have a linear distribution, which is good. It's still growing, but it's not as good as we had envisaged. We thought that IPv6 would really skyrocket, and we wouldn't talk about IPv6 every IX forum. So we're trying to stimulate this protocol, and we see this as a benefit for the future of the internet, but growth is still very slow. So looking at a linear chart, we can see that we'll get to 50% perhaps within 2 years' time, and IPv6 will be more broadly used than IPv4. But a question, are we going to keep up this growth, or will we level off? So we need to see where we want to be, IPv4 or IPv6. Here we understand that IPv6 is better. Now, looking at connectivity globally, we see this growth. And from the Google graph, I see other analysis that corroborate a linear chart. So if we see Google, AppNic, and Facebook, we have the same picture, so a linear growth. So we're still far from 50%. But notice that we have no IPv4, and the waiting list is for 5 years. So it would be 2027, 28. So we must force IPv6 to grow in terms of connectivity and the other issues I'm going to show you. As regards connectivity, when we look at Brazil, we see that we are close to 40%, so we're close to the world average. Our growth started in 2015, so the major depletion phases in our region. So it started seeing a shortage, lots of allocation of IP addresses, and people started moving. But the list is growing, and this is not helping greater growth. We would like to see it grow further. So we even had the World Day of IPv6 to stimulate its use, but what really drove IPv6 was the shortage of IPv4 addresses, and this is growing. But will we be able to grow to 50%? Can we overcome that, and perhaps IPv6 will be predominant on the internet? And in Brazil's connectivity, we see large companies. When we look at this chart, I put it all together, but the idea is that the yellow line in each of the charts is Brazil's average, and blue is the operator that I've selected. And we got a few AS systems, so we see that large operators, Telefónica, Live, TIM, they have a high IPv6 implementation rate, so they're pulling the average up. Therefore, somebody's pulling the average down. So major operators are investing in IPv6, but somebody is not contributing. And what do we see? Probably these are the small internet providers that do not care so much. But if you're there suffering with IPv4 now, in the future it will be a lot worse. Also because we have this waiting list that is only growing. And this situation is not unique to Latin America. It happens all over the world. Now, looking at content, taking a look at this Cisco's content statistics, we see that among the 5 top websites in terms of IPv6, we have 40%. When we go to the 1,000 top websites, it goes to 27% adoption. How? So we can sell IPv6 that is not that large, because we see only the large content companies moving towards IPv6, but not the smaller ones. So this is a sign of alert for us to think about how to leverage IPv6. Content must follow connectivity. And looking at Brazil, the situation is no different. So here we see the 5 top websites in Brazil. We're close to 30%. And according to our statistics that we have through the Topnic BR, and I recommend that you use this, everybody that does tests there, we could capture the data to see whether there is a reasonable adoption of IPv6. We see that it's not very different from other statistics data. And the top, in addition to testing out the website, it tests not only IPv6, HTTPS, runs a very complete test. It can test out emails and connectivity. And we see that of the 10,000 domains that were tested, 24% actually had IPv6. So we have a small number. Connectivity is close to 40, but content is not following through. And emails as well. If we look, 2,744, only 22% are implementing IPv6. And this is in terms of overall statistics. Now, when we look at universities, as we expect a higher number, also because they leverage the knowledge of our community, we see that they're not faring that better. So we've tested a number of universities, their websites, and many do not have IPv6. So we got 20%. And emails as well, close to 30%. When we look at governments, we see a situation that is dire. So we tested 600 and only 7% had a good IPv6 implementation score. And this score is related not only to DNS. DNS recursive must be in IPv6, and the comparison with the IPv4 website cannot be different from what they see in the IPv6 website. And among these, only 45 government websites have implemented IPv6, and in email the numbers are still very low. And these are statistics that we have at NIC-BR. Another point of attention, we've just seen a presentation by Ananog about VOTs, IoTs. So in a house with 28 IoTs, the fridge, mobile device, and only 10 had IPv6. So new machines are coming to the market that do not have IPv6, which is really very pernicious to the protocol. So much so that there's this debate that perhaps we'll need a new transition technique. And they talk about NAT46 or DNS46. This is an old idea, but now it's gaining impetus because these new devices only have IPv4. But from my point of view, I believe this is a disservice, because new technologies must move ahead or move along the future of Internet. So we could think about doing these workarounds. Perhaps IPv6 will never be implemented. So we have to force manufacturers to start using IPv6 by default in the equipment, so the IoTs that are coming up. And I'd like to tell you a story about a provider. During the courses that we deliver, they noticed that most of the streaming that their users watched had IPv6, but the smart TV didn't. And they noticed that their CGNAT traffic was very high. And then they have this smart idea: I must have these people convert to IPv6. So it created a plan, a streaming plan. And in the streaming plan, they would give a Chromecast, Apple TV that already had the IPv6 for them to stop using their smart TV. So the IPv6 traffic grew, and this is not that uncommon in the world of providers. And sometimes you have to help your client to make a wise choice, because they think that the problem is the internet, but it's the equipment that they're buying. So I will leave you with this idea to stimulate IPv6. And about 2023, we'll have 25 years since the creation of IPv6, 15 years of the IPv6 BR project, 5 years of RFC that make IPv6 a broadly used protocol. Can we get to 50% of adoption in Brazil? So I'm trying to predict the future. Will the stars help us? And I would like to ask you for your help for us to leverage IPv6. If you have any difficulties in terms of equipment, please report to us through the email, so that we will help you and try to make it, to try to leverage it. If you have any implementation difficulties, for us to try and overcome the 50% score. So I think that my time is up. I'd just like to give you an idea of our agenda, course agenda. We'll have, again, on-site IPv6 courses. This will be the complete course. It's not the advanced. We'll have 3 classes to try and stimulate those people who have faced problems in implementing IPv6. We always try to see whether there is or not demand, but when we look at this graph, we believe that it needs a further push. So we'll come back with a complete course. The basic you can do online. You can watch the recorded classes at your own pace. But if you want on-site classes, we'll have the 3 classes next year. And here we have the Big COP course as well, where we talk a lot about IPv6. And I'd like to cut the hair of the presentations because the examples in GTS are in double stack, but let's have more stacks, or at least in IPv6. Let's try to stimulate that at least in the presentations. So BCOP regional will have these 5 locations. You see, we will go to Porto Alegre, and Julio said that they're thinking about opening up a traffic exchange point in Feira de Santana, so a moment for us to understand the local connectivity and foster the implementation of this IX, Cuiabá, Belo Horizonte, and Belém. And this forum will tour this region, so we have this agenda, and the event is always on a Friday. Now, on Thursday, we'll try to have a more celebratory event to try to foster networking so that these PPT can grow, these traffic exchange points, so that the community will get together to make that traffic exchange point, that TEP, grow. We also have our online course agenda on BCOP, so if you cannot be present, you can watch the online course. We have a metaverse platform, and you can watch the classes. I'm showing you this data, but this is on our website of courses and events, and you can enroll. Just check the date of your convenience and enroll. We're still in the approving phase, but we want to launch a new course to dig deeper into this area of knowledge. So we're trying to create a pilot for certain cities to see whether we can create this new course, perhaps geared at those very small providers, to stimulate them to use the best practices. And then we're thinking about Petrolina, Palmas, and Montes Claros. Another piece of information, we have opened last course of the year, CCNA V7, and it's the 3rd module that adds to all the previous courses. It's a partnership with Cisco, and if you would like, please enroll today. So this is our concern, to deliver all the modules this year. So the course agenda and the sponsorship quotes are there on the website. So if you want, just go in there and enroll. And if you want to sponsor our events, online and on-site events, we are uploading to the site, to the website. I will show you the prices. So the idea is that if you want to help us through the sponsorship proposal, you will be very welcome. So we have that for online and on-site events. Online, it involves intra-network, the skills enhancing week, and we have the dates for next year. And also because we have an intra-network that will happen in November this year, we're going to talk about service denial. So you can enroll in that as well. On-site courses, we are charging 18,000 per person, and online 30,000. If you buy both together, you will be eligible to a discount. And as regards benefits, you will find everything in the website for you to see what you will get if you help us spread this knowledge to the Brazilian community. Thank you very much. This was my presentation. I'm trying to remain in my time slot. Thank you very much, Eduardo.
I would like to invite Kleber from Nick BR. He will talk about number resources, and he will provide us an update. Good morning. My name is Kleber, and I work in the BR registry, and I will share some information of my department. Some aspects were mentioned before, so I will be very brief. We have GSM, IPv6, and IPv4 allocations when we have it available. An IPv4 block was extinguished some times ago, so the allocation now is part of a queue list. And this is part of the policies of allocation defined by LACNIC, and after that they are authorized by the Registro BR. These policies are defined and organized by the Internet community. So any person has an ability to organize a new policy or change a current policy. So that's an open and seamless process. And first we have initial discussions of the proposals, and then in the forums of the events of LACNIC. Currently, we have the validation of the security and abuse of ASNs. So these policies enforce, so all these abuse and security notifications are done through a process that is made by including the contact of the entity and the abuser contact. So they are then contacted and they accept the current rules. The validation is done in every 15 days. If we do not receive the validation, we resend the process until the person accesses the email and confirm that. If it's not done for a long time period, the resources may be recovered. So today we have 96% of the contacts already validated. So we are still missing 348 ASNs. PKIs. So since the end of 2019, we have the certifying entity delegated model until the CRILNet Labs repository or through the Registro BR. And today we have more than 1,700 entities with the enabled RKI. Some statistics of ASN allocations. We have almost 9,000 allocated so far, 488 in 2021, and more than 1,000 in 2020 when we have the total extinguisher of the shortage of the processes. At that time, the IPv6 allocations were 940, and 96% of those companies already have the IPv6 allocated. This is the Google statistics, and total of IPv6 allocated, 21% were denounced. These are the data of the NIC BR, Registro BR data. In 2019, it was about 27%, and today we had an increase in 22 to 46% of the use of the IPv6. About the IPv4, if the company is willing to receive an IPv4, And so we need to have the queue, the waiting queue, and we will try to meet the needs and check if we have resources available to supply the queue list. And so these blocks that were recovered and returned on to us, we have at least a quarantine of 6 months to release those and to make these pool of addresses available. And all these ITCs approved in this line will be part of the entrance list. And this other chart shows the amount of IPv4 numbers available to meet the need of this queue line. Here we have some data of IPv4 release, and there was a major release in early 2021, and then we had a decrease. In August, we did not have any of them released. Another chart shows a comparison about the released address and those that are required to meet the queue demand. So we would request a lot of released address in order to meet the demand of this queue. And we'll probably not be able to provide the numbers. And here you see the amount of recovered blocks, and you could see there was a decrease in the number of IPs recovered, probably because the companies, they checked the value of the IPv4 and hardly ever they do not comply with the rules and policies and return on the IPs. That's it. If you have any questions, I can answer your questions. Kleber, thank you. Kleber, Julio, and Eduardo will be with us at the coffee break. Now we have a break, 30-minute break, and we will resume the session at 11:05. And the material is available in our website. Everything was uploaded in the website. The coffee break area is just next door, and then you can just turn around and go there. Thank you. Let's resume our agenda. The people are coming from the coffee break. I would like to invite Daniel Fink from MICA to speak about DNS and extensions. So please, Daniel, you have the floor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Galvão. I'm very pleased to be back in face-to-face meetings. We had some regional IACS events, and it has been excellent so far. Thank you very much. I'm here to replace Nicolai Antoniello. I will speak about him later on. And the idea was to share with you some new aspects about DNS extensions, and I would like to take this opportunity to make the first presentation of an innovation that ICANN did to all of you, which is the program Kind DNS, which is the manners of the DNS. In the latest years, we have been organizing training courses on installations of impulsive servers, enabling of DNS SEC. It's never easy. New providers, people willing to enhance the structures, but to have some aspects connected with DNS is something extremely complicated. So we have a list of all the RFCs for DNS, and we have 297 RFCs that established the first DNS protocol. So we have 2,800 pages of texts, 2,200 pages of tasks, but do you believe providers have time to read all that? No. And every presentation, Daniel comes here and say, we have this innovation in DNS, you need to do this and that, and then we ask ourselves, what should I do? That's not an easy task. For me to attend the DNSSEC training courses, I had to be structured enough to read and understand, and we need to collect data from different places. And this, what is happening with DNS will keep on occurring, and we have DNS being complemented, which is the DNSSEC, and we want to make it safer with a high level of security. And we have new resources of registry, and this is not going to end. We will always evolve. While we have DNSSEC and the provider, they do not have time for DNS, but we should have it, because we never forget it. We install it and forget it. That's not the reality. Sometimes we have to hire experts with thorough knowledge about DNS, but that's something that will keep on happening. And one of the targets of ICANN lately, when it comes to technical innovation, it's not useful to have the latest technology in DNS and in root operators, and NICBR is one of these groups. The best operations of servers we have in the world, secure, stable, resilient. If at the other end, the provider, they have failures and vulnerabilities. So DNS is so strong as the weakest link in the chain. That's why I can establish this target of getting closer to providers and teaching providers on how to use it. And that's what we will do. And the questions we will have lately is how a small provider will learn or will understand why they need to implement a DNS over a TNS or HTTPS to have security in place. So we talk about it in the events. And what about encryption? What's the level of encryption I should have in my authoritative DNS, SH1, SH156 or 256? So the manager needs to understand what he needs so he can express that to the provider owner or to a supplier. That's why we decided to organize the kindness or kind DNS, which are the manners of sharing DNS distancing as well as domain names. So ICANN launched this initiative, and it was being discussed in Kuala Lumpur last month. And the first translation of this material I'm sharing with you. That's the name of the program, the translation in Portuguese. The slides are available in the page 2X. And the idea is that the kindness is a portal, a service that promotes community promotion services, so we can focus on the segmentation of DNS operators. We have authoritative levels, people that work with TRDs, and also second tier or second level. In recursives, we have three groups: those that deal with private recursives, or when they shared recursives, and sometimes you have it for only your customers, and for those that operate a public DNS. If there is anyone in the audience, we can talk about it. But that's the group of the 888, etc. And the best practices for the system itself, connected with the infrastructure services. And Kindness recommends the best practices and check if your system is updated in the key requirements. And I brought you some categories of best practices that Kindness approaches in authoritative level. So enable the DNSSEC zone, limit the transfer between authoritative services zones, control the integrity of the zone or zone integrity, allocate the structure for in authoritative and primary and secondary services, two different names for each zone, and authoritative services based on what should be performed and based on a diversified infrastructure to have a higher resilience in the system, as well as monitor the infrastructure. These are the best practices that are suggested. Here, the same best practices for recursive providers. And here we have best practices, as Kindness calls them, the service that work in this area. In DNSSEC, we always highlight that we always need to enable DNSSEC, and we were going to teach you how you can enable that in the bind or in Unbound, and this should be done in the configuration file. So the last configuration, in the last versions of the bind and Unbound, does not require enabling the NSSEC. And I believe there are some softwares which are very interesting. If you simply install a recursive resource in Unbound, it's going to be enabled. And if you have any question, you can access the top site and then check if it's happening in your network. The access instructions that should be restricted to your networks confirm if the minimization or mitigation of the queue name is happening, and never let an authoritative server operate in the same machine as a recursive one. They should have any separated infrastructure. And if you want to adopt encryption, and that's a user demand to implement DOH or DOT, that should be active, as well as the software diversity and private operators. This is also a key element in different softwares. Maybe you are highly acquainted with everything I'm mentioning, but kindness also have the explanations and the rationale behind each one of those factors. Here it's in English, but these are for authoritative operators in critical zones and those that work with private servers, and the recommendations for closed public resolvers. And here we have a way to strengthen the system to have a more resilient structure in place, together with the best practices for the software. Best routing practices, the K8 implementation, control the configuration files, versions. Kindness also assess that. The site has some tools for self-assessment. You answer a questionnaire and they ask you what is the best practices that are implemented in your server or not, and then you can have your assessment done. These are private and confidential data. We are not going to share the self-assessments, but at the end of the day you have a PDF report issued by the site so you can understand your current score and what should be done. In the aspects that you need to think about implementation, you have a tutorial link available, and it's extremely cool and explains how you are going to have the implementation data in the bind or in the DNS. Everything is explained. And it's also included in your self-assessment. In 10 minutes you can run your self-assessment and upload the report easily. And you can subscribe to Kindness to receive the updates. And if you have everything implemented and the best practices in place, you can inform to us. You have also the goodwill ambassadors. Sometimes the translation into Portuguese is not so good, but that's the idea. And your question is, but at the end of the day, what's the website of Kindness? That's it. You can see this in the slide, and you can access our website and you can see all the interaction tools we have available for you. Here you can see some screens of the Kindness website. In addition to self-assessment, you are also invited to join the community and inform for those that are coordinating the Kindness that you have your best practices implemented. The idea is to invite you to inform that and also receive a best practices seal, be awarded a seal that can be placed in your corporate website as well as in the global website. We have some there already. This assessment is going to happen through a form in the website, but you can also contact the kindness staff through email or directly informing we concluded the best practices implementation, and the personnel of ICANN are going to check all that. Practices such as monitoring inside the network you will not be able to detect, but some others we can. And that's more or less the criteria to be acknowledged here. I mentioned to Adiel in Kuala Lumpur that he needs to be prepared because we will have a lot of Brazilian providers in the kindness database. I expect so. Here you see the kindness org site map. You can check all the best practices and you can check each one of them. I hope you have fun. I know about the first question, how will be the first question, but I have some ideas for that. But then you can go there and share with your boss the self-assessment reports after you apply for that. And the person that should be here today talking to you is Nicolas Antoniello. I believe you have already met him in the past because he was part of some online events. He is extremely competent and skilled to talk about DNS, much more than I am. And we are very proud to have Nicolas among us. He is from Uruguay, and he is our representative for the region for technical relationship. He speaks Spanish, but he speaks so much that you are able to understand what he is expressing. So I believe Nikolai is listening to us now. He is attending another event in Yucatan in Mexico. It's where we had a meteor fall that killed the dinosaurs in the past.
Okay, and something cool that Nicolas did was to create this virtual lab where we do the courses and we open terminals of virtual machines in the browser of each student. And this is something else I'd like to talk to you about. After the courses, we love to receive your feedback and questions. Daniel, how can I do this or that? And some of you are here. We have interacted already to improve your DNS operation, and please get in touch. I have a question about this kindness recommendation. How do I do it? Well, let's test it. So this virtual lab is great. We'll send you the link, and we open bound and we set it up. Or if you want to do that to train your team, we can use this tool, and Nicolas can explain how to use it. I can help. So the idea is to be very close and do not hesitate to get in touch to implement some of these things. Okay? So this was my part. Gilberto, I think there is some synergy with TOP as well. Perhaps we could talk about that. This is a new program. Any suggestion is welcome. And I believe that one of the first questions that you'll ask will be, is it in Portuguese, Daniel? So who's interested in that? I believe so. It's a promise by ADL. But I will ask again. I believe that translation into Portuguese is super cool. It's part of the plan, but we could put together a lobby to try to push Portuguese translation to the top of the line. So I'll ask you again. Would you like to have the Portuguese version of kindness? Yes, I'll take a picture and send it to ADL. Who wants the translation into Portuguese? Well, I'll put this in Twitter. And perhaps he'll come to Brazil to launch kindness in Portuguese. So here you've got my email. Thank you very much. Any questions to Daniel? We have microphones. If you have any questions, please feel free. Thank you, Daniel. I'd now like to invite Dulcilene Barros de Assunção. She is from Bampará, and she's going to talk about the importance of the safe availability of financial services and multiple TEPs, traffic exchange points. Good morning. The importance of availability in financial services with multiple PTTs. We must use MAC1. Everybody knows that safety is very important and it's very strategic. We have a set of controls and policies to check the integrity and confidentiality and availability to protect all of our assets. Assets are people, physical assets, in addition to the data that we have. That has to do with information, with the components, online and physical, station, IoTs, processes, electronics or not. Followed by awareness of the people, of the top management, so that they're not the weakest link in the process, down to the receptionist that will give access to somebody and we don't know where this person is going and they are not identified. Always being ethical according to the conduct code of the institution and being careful about the IDs in networks and systems. And for all that, we need monitoring. Do I have a monitoring limit? Yes. If I do not inform people that I am monitoring, I cannot do a complete monitoring. So the persons to be monitored must be aware and must accept this monitoring. So I need them to sign, be them partners, associates, trainees. We need them to be aware. And we have the issue of threats. So they will exploit a vulnerability like a risk. A risk is an adverse effect, direct or indirect, that we may come up against. So the threat can be intentional or accidental, from inside or outside. And it causes this effect, although sometimes it doesn't want to destroy or damage. And incidents sometimes are the exploitation of a threat that we are not aware of, and it becomes an accident and can lead to a potential loss in a critical process of the company. And until we can recover and go back to the initial point, it takes a while. So I must know my recovery time so that my environment will be back to normal. Here we have security incidents and a cyber incident. And in addition to the adverse effect, it affects the systems, technology systems, as regards traffic points, PTTs. This is where interconnections occur among providers. Is it similar to a multi-point network? No, it's totally different. Do I get to choose to travel through more than one PPT? No, sometimes we don't. It's a need, particularly in a state where we have more than 1 million square kilometers. There are places in our state that are closer to the neighboring state than our own. So we must know where my data is navigating through so that I can make the service available. And then we get to the issue of risk. Will I have a risk? Yes. I must always check my risk. And what is the risk? Is to know that this is an internal or external effect, and it's unpredictable. So risk is like a wolf loose in a sheepskin. So I must know how many wolves in sheepskin there are, how many I have, how many I can mitigate, and how can be mitigated. Will it affect me? So we must assess risk to know the risk and to know the reward, to deter the risk and mitigate what we must. And that will help me control security incidents. Be level 2 or level 7 in the application layer. In every layer I'll have some risk, but we must see into the layers, and we must be aware of the risk of our infrastructure, of our processes, of our systems, and where everything I need to function properly is. So monitoring will help us in that. To do the controls to avoid spoofing on layer 2, 3, policy configuration, IPsec, to check whether anything abnormal is going on. Security, we do the first blockage and then we see what happens. But this is what we do. If it's abnormal, let's check what's going on. But we must be aware of the abnormality that is affecting the system. And confidentiality, secrecy. Well, on 27.0 002, we have more control. We have detection of dual purpose that corrects and identifies and corrects abnormal behavior to deter IT incidents. So this is a control that didn't used to exist before. That was a procedure that we implemented, but now it's been formalized. Two KPIs that we can mention here. We have interruption to my system, to my environment, owing to an incident. So what's the percentage of this disruption? Did it come from outside or inside? What was the cause? And these incidents, how much business disruption did they cause? What was the potential loss? If I can control these metrics together with my infrastructure, I can have these controls and monitor in terms of my ROI. Thank you. Thank you, Dulcilene. Do we have any questions? I'd like to invite Fernando Frediani from Americanet, Ultrawave, the importance of ratification of CPS for ISPs. Remember that you have our material on the website. Good morning, everyone. I am Fernando Frediani. I'm an engineer, and I deal with network engineering management at Ultrawave Telecom, part of Americanet. And I'm going to talk about my experience in the ratification of CPEs, which is so important in delivering broadband to users, and sometimes it goes unnoticed when they are to ratify a new product. When a supplier offers you, many times people are price tempted. So I'll try to share with you a few important points when you need to ratify a CPE to implement that in your operation in consumer's home. Many people sometimes buy CPEs based on cost rather than on technical specs. And this is bad because they will be surprised when they run into trouble. And to correct that at home, it's always more costly. Sometimes there are problems caused by firmware bugs. And this is not apparent at the moment of the purchase unless you do the ratification. There are also difficulties or impossibility of automation and remote management, and so you need to send a technician to your user's home to replace a CPE, and if you had remote management, this would cut cost and time. There are many cases of unstable drivers or Wi-Fi. At first sight, it seems like everything is working properly, but with time you see the problems arising. Problem chipsets that do not forward packages, and perhaps one of the most important points that many people offer as the reason not to implement that is support to IPv6. And there's a specific presentation about IPv6, and it's important to talk about that. So for starters, what do we need when a manufacturer or sales rep offers you a new CPE model? Well, let's get a few sample units for you to test in your lab. Try to find out the chip that CPE uses. I'm not going to go into chip manufacturers, but there are a few that have a doubtful reputation, so you should be on alert. One of the first questions I ask is, what's the chipset that you use? Because there are a few that are a lot better than others. And you should ask, who does the firmware build if you need to correct a bug? Because sometimes the seller is not the manufacturer, and this puts obstacles in the correction of an important problem. And something that I really recommend when you are ratifying the equipment is to install in the user's home. It's to no avail just to test it out on the bench. So I usually bring the CPE to my home and install it, because it's on a day-to-day basis that you actually see real problems. And there you will expose the CPE to different scenarios, because you've got users of all kinds. You have offices, large house, small house. You have houses with lots of home automation devices. And particularly in this respect, I found a problem in the CPE that had a relationship with home automation devices. These devices, they send multicast to communicate, to tell the user that they're on the network. So the multicast was blocking the CPE. So this is the kind of thing that you find out when you actually install the CPE at the user's home. So just testing it out on the lab bench won't do. And also be attentive to applications that demand low latency, VoIP, etc., because sometimes there's an intense flow, and if it stutters, it will impact these low latency applications.
Validate the functioning and IPv6 stability, and not only after authentication. You sometimes are browsing, navigating, but issues happen later on. And document everything you do. We have inside documentation that is corrected based on different scenarios and changes. Sometimes a scenario is not a consistent one, so we need to test several times to compare consistency. Now we are going to embark on performance validation. When you have a CPE, you need to validate the cable traffic, how much it can withstand. That's extremely important. And make the same test, both in IPv4 and IPv6. Sometimes I had this happening. IPv6 was working perfectly, and IPv4 was working perfectly, and IPv6 not. Sometimes we had a ship issue. They had a firmware change and corrected the issue. And this had an impact on the users that were using IPv6 system, and they had issues in performance. And sometimes you have reboots along the day. Sometimes CPEs are apparently worker, but when you have enhanced traffic that is being processed through a certain ship, it gets hot and it has an impact on the traffic. And you also need to check the CPU figures. You can see that in the web interface or Telnet, where you can check the CPU, the software RQ, and when you have a high level of traffic, it's not common to have an CPU use. This is done in the ship. If the CPU is too high, it's wrong, even when you have high traffic. And I could see cases that CPU was so high in terms of traffic that it stopped responding. And the most common scenario of the users is Wi-Fi. So you can check that on Wi-Fi in terms of gigahertz to get too close to the plans that are traded today. And you also test the distance of the CPE. If you do not have any connection drop or downtime, if you move that from a household to a company and expose the CPE to high traffic, and check if there are not interferences from other devices operating in the same frequency. And there are several tools that you can use to validate performance. The most important one is the IPRF3, in my opinion, because it's truly going to test the memory to memory. It does not resort on disk. So it crosses the CPE, the switch, until it reaches the server. But you also need to test speed and velocity, because if the server is far from where you are testing, there are latency issues and ways that you are not able to control. Sometimes you do not have the test matching what is required, but depends on where you are using it. If it is in the IX or if it is closer to your connection, you perform all those tests both with MU and CPE and the bridge or routed, because you have differences. And maybe some of them, they do not make the bridge option available for the user, but I believe it should be done because it does not change anything at the provider, and the routed one facilitates the life of the user, and it's not costly. And you need to perform several tests. The NU that is in your house needs to be tested in the evening and the morning every time you can to have a sound results connected with the tests being performed. And to validate provisioning, it depends on the VEIP, depend on the ONU and the PE that you are buying. Otherwise, you need to organize a VEP and VEIP, validate to test the validity of that ONU with the case of that OLT. If your CPE acts as a DNS, and it makes a query to the DNS at the provider, which is very common, you need to check if the daemon that is running inside the CPE is contacting the IPv4 and IPv6, right? Because otherwise you have a query fail. And sometimes you need to connect the issues and solve the issues of the addresses RFC 1918. And this can be corrected easily inside the operation. The WRT has WRT has a checkbox that allow you to solve this issue. And there are some other aspects connected with the local cache at the CPE. And you need to check if the web interface is minimally acceptable in terms of the basic features. Not only change the SSID as well as the HCP parameters. Sometimes you need to change the lease time of the LAN because you have a high number of Wi-Fi users, so you need to change the lease time. You can choose not to use the CPE as a DNS, but inform your local DNS and check if you have a bind with the MAC against IP. These are all important because sooner or later you have a user that is not so important, but you do not want to lose this customer, this client. For example, they are going to request this from you, and if you do not have it available, you take you longer to get all you need for the process. Another aspect is the UPnP, which is quite controversial. We have some concerns of security, but it solves a lot of issues at the client side. We can have a dynamic public IP, and it seems it solves some issues at the end of the day. So you need to validate if it is operating properly. The VPnP/PCP works well with IPv4, but we also need to take into account the IPv6. We do not have support for that, but in the future we will, in a way that I use to validate the operation of the UPnP, not only checking the gains of re-automated ports, but we also have the UPnP mini UPnP project where you make some run tries and some scenarios and you check if there was the redirectioning and if it is just a release of the fire to cross the traffic against the layer. And another major aspect to avoid headaches along the way is the operation of the VPNs and the AUGs, which facilitate the process. The most used one are the PPTP and IPsec, and you have a way to validate if they are operating properly, if behind the CEP they are being able to connect with the VPN. And if you have more than one user operating in that, and that's why you are going to have the ALG's operation. Sometimes you have the husband and wife working in the same company and they need to connect through the same VPN. I got some scenarios in this format, and also VoIP application that supports in the process. ACL control at the web interface. Check if you're able to redirect the doors in IPv4, traffic in towards the LAN and IPv6. So your fire releases the traffic which are sent to IPv6. Those that already implemented TR 09069, it's important to check if the CPE records correctly at the server, ICS, or if you're able to send commands to the CPE at any given moment And so you will not depend only on the informs. So you need to check if the CPE is informing properly in the allocated time. And for those that use TR069, you need to rectify if all the required attributes for the support are in place. Because sometimes you have some details missing and you do not find the data in the TR069. They implement, they send you an updated version, and you can have that attribute and data available readily. There were some cases where we had the TCW-MP client that stopped communication, and then you do not have a connection with the CRNU or ONU, and you cannot access remotely. And there are some cases where you can have an access of the ONU telnet. You can see the client is down, so the manufacturer fixed that. And all the OIP updates need to be performed if it is dialing correctly, if it's calling correctly, if the codex is operating properly in both directions, and the dial plan, if it's properly configured. And another issue that I caught in multiple scenarios and from other colleagues that have similar scenarios, when you have TR069 and VoIP in addition to the internet and a traditional PPOE, each one of them has a VRF. So they need to have applications going through different WANs. Cannot be the same and cannot depend on the internet connection. They are required to reestablish the internet connection in the user that changed something, lost configuration. So you need to have a specific WAN, and sometimes the FQDN used to go towards the TR06 or 9 or the VoIP requires a IP. We had some cases connected with that were corrected, and we could work from there. And also you need to check if the CPE allows customization, preset. URL server to URL69, change the admin standard user password. Sometimes it can easily infect your CPE. You cannot have an ultra secret password, but you can also make it available for the user to make his changes. If he wants to change the Wi-Fi, the user can do that himself, but the admin password could not be changed. Sometimes you have the admin password and you have a simplified user that has access for the basics. Change the Wi-Fi password, redirect a port, and do something that is useful in your operation. This is another issue, which is complex. Sometimes you do not have heat dissipation. In hot days, you have the CPE stuck because you do not have an airflow. And so you need to check if the CPE is in a hotter atmosphere, in a hotter room, to check if it's working properly, because sometimes temperature can cause instability to the chip heating, and the chip does not behave according to its design. And for some, it's important the name of LAN ports, based on the client scenario. So it's good that the client has LAN connected to the LAN or video games, because if you have more devices consuming Wi-Fi resources, you will have less complaints connected with the high traffic spectrum. And if you have telephone services that delivers more than one telephone call service, you need additional FX ports. Who's going to sell you the ONU? It's going to be the OE, the manufacturer, or a salesperson. And how much do the team depend on the chip manufacturer for the decision-making process? Otherwise, the technical skills are not enough, and they do not have any access to the SDK. Sometimes it's a proxy that needs to be referred to a third party to perform the activities every time you require a correction. Because this is one of the most weak points, because sometimes you will exchange a lot of emails with someone that is not able to solve your issue. So the access to the support services and the person in charge of the firmware adjustments and setup is really important. Now I will talk about the IPv6 aspects, because some people say I always have the IPv6 in the backbone, in my core, in my ONUs, but these are some points that you need to focus on ratification. Today, Eduardo mentioned we have 39% of autonomous Brazilian systems operating. The highest content generators are operating properly, and those that are providers and owners of providers, you reduce significant expenses of equipment with CGNAT. You reduce the amount of public IPv4s available in your database, and a meaningful reduction of the logs generated. You meet the final report of GT IPv6 of major operators. You need to deliver the public IP for the users and new and legacy systems. So it facilitates in the breach of secrecy for identification of user requested by police authorities and legal authorities, not requiring information from the origin port. So you can provide that. The traffic flows directly from the BNGs, from the core to the edge, without need of having a bottleneck or expensive equipment. And it is also showing is committed to the technological evolution of the internet and is not waiting longer to implement IPv6. And as I mentioned, you need to validate the performance in IPv6 content, because the users will say, but when I access a certain level of content, it's not performing properly. You have the IPv6, but the chip of the CPE is not working properly. There is another issue that happened in the past. Maybe it was corrected today, but I saw recently happening.
The CPE has IPv6, but at a certain point in time, it loses the gateway with DNG. So the device continues to have IPv6 in the LAN, but it doesn't communicate to the rest of the world. So users try to access an IPv6 content, and he has to go back to IPv4, and so it feels like it's slow. And sometimes this happens after days that the CPE has been working. there are some CPs that you have to watch closely to see whether the one is working, the slack, or a DHCP. So you have to check the correct functioning of IPv6 with slack or DHCP. This bullet point to check whether the web interface has a manual manipulation of the ACL. This is something that manufacturers must pay more attention and start implementing, because you've got a client that has a DVR and for some reason either doesn't have the cloud function or they want to use port redirectioning, but you cannot give him IPv4 because you don't have that anymore. So you give him IPv6 and you tell them you have to set it up, you manage your ports in IPv6, but then if the CPE doesn't have this resource, what will your user do? So it's important to have the ACL in IPv6 so that you can deal with these scenarios where you cannot use the cloud function or the app does not make the request of free traffic for PVC. And the prefix that you've received, the prefix delegation received, check the size to see whether it won't cause any problem with the CPE and whether the CPE can update the prefix delegation in a reconnection and announce that to the rest of the network if it has a PPO and PPPoE reconnection and it was capable of updating that in the LAN after authentication, because your user will navigate on IPv4 and then there are problems related to your CGNAT consuming traffic unnecessarily. And every CPE should have a firewall, so you have to check whether it was not forgotten not to allow incoming connections aimed for the one of the CPE. So let IPv6 go through to the one and to the LAN prefixes. But I think that with IPv6, this is a problem when people want to block that. So check whether the standard setup allows that, or ask for a correction with the manufacturer. And do not allow incoming connections headed for the LAN prefix or your hosts in your LAN. So that's no good. So you have to allow whatever you need, but in a controlled way. When you send requests for firmware corrections to your supplier, they will send you a new build, a new version, and it's important for you to validate everything all over again. So I've seen cases when you ask for a little problem to be corrected and the firewall has been messed up. So you have to do the entire validation again. Obviously, you will validate it in the lab, but many times you can have surprises that they were fixing up something and they messed up something else. This is just a few basic details about the backbone. Since you are ratifying your CPA so that it will work well in IPv6, check your backbone, your DNG. If IPv6 has been set up and is correctly delivering that to those CPEs if it has the correct amount of prefix delegation. If you have /40, you will deliver 64,000/56 if that is announced to the ping, so that you can have regularity and similarity in your traffic, also in PV6. If you have done good traffic engineering in IPv4, if you're starting to implement IPv6, you should be attentive and also review the correct setup of your SPF from the core to the edges. Here we have Latin America, we have Brazil with 39%. It's an interesting number. We have countries that are ahead, India and the US, but I believe we're doing fine. There's still a lot to go in terms of content. This is the chart of LACNIC Lab of our ASN. We reached 84% in penetration. So this thanks to the works of the new CPS and ratification, so that everything will work on IPv6, but also to take the legacy CPEs and check whether we could have an upgraded firmware to scrutinize millions of CPEs that had IPv6 disabled. So we did this detailed job, and it was worth it. This is the result, that we had a much higher rate than the country's 39% average. And for those of you who are not convinced yet, this is a non-exhaustive list of major contents supported by IPv6. I should have added globo.com, but it's not yet ready. And in conclusion, a quick wrap up. Run all the necessary tests and validations to meet all the services offered by the provider. Make sure that the IPv4 performance is similar to the IPv6 performance. If it's not, there's something wrong in the SDK, in the firmware, so ask your provider. Validate the stability of the firmware and the hardware for overheating and locking because of high temperatures, etc. Validate all the necessary details so that IPv6 will work. And we have very specific slides about IPv6 that show all of what can go wrong, and this can undermine the willingness of your team to implement IPv6 correctly, and require from the vendor or the manufacturer correction of all the problems that you found during your ratification before you commit yourself to buying. So do not fall for, oh, you have to purchase and then I will fix up everything that is wrong. Don't go for that, because sometimes there are very serious problems, and sometimes the manufacturer doesn't know how long it will take him to correct that. So enforce your consumer rights and require that they do the basics to deliver a product that works properly with no bugs. Okay, thank you. I'm open to your questions. Hello, I'm André. Congratulations on your presentation. I'd like to ask two questions. Based on your experience, what have you seen in terms of problem CPEs, software or hardware, and what to do with CPEs that do not work with IPv6? Most of the problems are connected to firmware bugs. And that's what you have to work with the manufacturer. But hardware problems are minimal. Now, what do you do with CPEs that have IPv4? Well, change it. Buy an IPv6 CPE and exchange that. But you have to see how much it's going to cost it. So to find a firmware that will work for that legacy CPE, if you do not have a remote management, you'll have to send a technician to the user's house. And if you have to send a person, you can replace the CPE. But by and large, I'd say replace the CPE, because you will harmonize your operation, you will remove your old CPEs that many times do not even have support anymore. Good morning. Congratulations on your presentation. It seems like it was a change log of my work over the past 2 years, and I know exactly the equipment that you've tested. And it's funny that 2 of the problems that were new were the IPv6 client of prefix delegation. When they go renew, the CP does the renew again. So they have 10 devices and they do a DPoS on the system because they're doing renew nonstop. And another stopgap that manufacturers use, the CP starts sending a DHCP state with need reboot. So that you say, well, HCP, I am doing a reboot, so hold on, because I'll get back and ask for it again. But it does that with the device on. And it starts doing that every so many hours. And why did they start doing that? A few of the things that you've mentioned. And I asked the manufacturer to fix that, but he did another stopgap solution. And it's interesting because I imagine that we have rework here, and perhaps we could put together all these efforts and work on a template for manufacturers, because probably we use the same manufacturers and we go through the same problems in IPv6. Thank you very much for sharing your scenario. Hello, I'm Ayub from Sant Nectus. I think you are cooperating with the community. Perception that many providers offer a good price and we buy. And to share a case that I've got, it was a provider with many CPEs, with many problems. We set up a lab and and we made several bench tests, and we found out that a number of firmwares had problems. And the same lab would take a look at the new devices. And sometimes we had to dump a certain CPEs. And one of these purchases, we received the first CPEs, and we found a bug before the big lot came. And we had to be very firm and said to the manufacturer, if you send us this batch with this problem, we will refuse the purchase. And we said, if you do not figure out the problem, we will not buy that. And they had to bring a foreign consultant. So please test before the purchase and do not accept the purchase if you find a bug. Ayub, I've heard from some people a few times, and perhaps these people will not be pleased at what I have to say. I've heard many times people said, well, if it weren't for us to buy these cheap CPEs, we would not have reached the place where we are. I do not believe that. There are accessible CPEs. Perhaps it's not that low price, but it's accessible. It fits the operation because this is a cost that will come back to you in a number of other ways. Customer dissatisfaction, the dent to your reputation, all of that has a cost as well. So how can you ensure that a number of customers dropped out because they had a problem with that shitty CPE? So I don't believe this talk that I wouldn't be this big if I hadn't bought very cheap CPEs, but there are accessible options, and if you test them, you can have the best of both worlds. Thank you. Congrats. I'd like to add something that I've seen. I'd like to reinforce, you have 15 minutes. I was fortunate to get, oh, I'm sorry. I was fortunate to participate. The GB Corp, B Corp of LACNOG. I don't know whether Lucimar is here. It's about B Corp for CPs. If you do not read that document, do it. It's worth it. And what you said about the cost, I think you were too kind. And you were very careful. What's the cost of a technical visit to a household? At least 20 reals, just for the guy to go there. Probably it's much higher than the difference between the two CPAs that you did not buy. So what's the cost of a 1 hour at the call center? Just do this math, and you will see every year it will have paid off. Now, another addition, validation of requisites, not only for the present. Today, the Brazilian market is 100% in double stack with CGNAT, but in the future, we're going to converge to 464X LAT. Will your CPE support this upgrade? And this is an addendum. From Unicamp, congratulations for the presentation, a consideration and a question. From the monitoring that you've mentioned, that's important to monitor because home users see a tutorial, and if that network is slow, they will disable IPv6, and all your excellent work and all your tips go down the drain. But this is the power of TR-069. You can enable that. So monitoring is important because of that. If they saw a tutorial and there is a movement to disable IPv6, so they've heard from a friend or from a student. And two questions. We saw in Vinicius's presentation the use of the Zulu address in the one, and also about the poor scenario, about the use of tools, transition mechanisms such as CLAT at the CPs. We have two questions by Gilberto Zorello. I don't know why he doesn't want to use the mic, but I'll ask my question first. It's been a while since I touched that, but please correct me if I'm wrong. CPEs must be ratified by Anatel. And the ratification process, everything that you've presented today, do they see anything? Do they? No, they don't.
I just would like to hear from you in this scenario. We are just going to have the electronic RF aspects and not the operational aspects. Unfortunately, they do not run tests on this level of details. That's a requirement that since 2014 that they should provide IPv6 support. But the idea is that it has the IPv6 stack in the operational system of the CPE, but I do not believe these are validated when we rectify the product to be sold in Brazil. It would be worthy to do that, but what's the cost that lack of that is generating to all of us, and that could be reviewed for those that perform this type of rectification. I believe in the past there was a list of requirements to be made available to distribute your pieces of equipment. I believe in the web interface you have a tool, an additional flag that would be IPv6. I believe this could be contacted at the Anatel level, and that's an excellent point. Duni, I am Gilberto, and I would like to know what are the security requirements that you believe should be assessed in the CPE, because you talked about the document, which is the best practice of minimal security requirements to acquisition of equipment to subscribers connection. There is a checklist, but I would like to know what are the security requirements. I mentioned some of them, not to have an open firewall for the CPE and a one unless you have a manual port redirection system in place. Not send the CPE to the user's house with admin. You can insert any other password such as admin batatinha, because you have malwares and you have automations that are going to access through the LAN, and it will infect the CPE and will do what he wants. And I do not know if at the CPE would be the best thing to place it, because some things would be solved at the BNG, not to have a CP BCP 38 in the package. So it's just a suggestion, and that would not be mandatory. I have my questions on that. That's an excellent discussion. Maybe that's an additional way of having one more layer and not implementing it in the BNG for different reasons. These are these top of mind. And to be able to close doors and not leave open ports when you install that at the client. I believe this also requires security protocols to control communication. Open ports sometimes are remotely controlled through the web. We understand we can apply CLs to access from a specific network inside the provider, but I believe this is still a security concern. I believe the best way to do that is to have a bidirectional effort in this case. I would like to talk about the RPF blocking, because if you take into account the attacks, many of them would not arrive spoofed, but they are still arriving, because you have the CPE that is not effective, that get the package and then masquerade and sends it. So the effectiveness of the DDoS for the zombie attack happened. So I understand that this theoretically consumes more hardware capacity, but that's an important aspect. I believe you have an excellent aspect that you expressed. It happens truly. Thank you for joining. Your presentation was very good. Well, now we are going to have a lunch break. We will come back at 2 p.m. with a very interesting panel with the internet access provider and the importance of the IXBR for them. So we see you back at 2 p.m.